In some ways, I always feel like Yehuda Levi, Libi b'mizrach, v'ani b'sof ha'ma'arav, that my heart is in the East, even if I am in the West. But how much the more so in weeks in which things are difficult in Israel. Ever since my first time in Israel 35 years ago, my heart, a piece of it, has always been there. And it's been an exceedingly hard week for all of us. I want to thank my Torah study class this morning when they saw that I was really struggling and quite emotional, said, Rabbi, we think that you need to take a little time and we'll see you later. And I really appreciate that. There was just so much love this morning and I needed it and I felt it. And the appreciation I have for this loving community is just endless. So thank you. And I'm glad I get to share some thoughts with you. Perhaps a few more than some. A lot of my heart, a lot of that I wanted to say, and I hope you'll have a little patience for that. When I first became an Israeli-Palestinian peace activist more than 30 years ago, I thought the conflict in Israel was between Jews and Palestinians. Over the years, I've come to realize that the conflict is actually between those who believe that both peoples can find a way to live peacefully together and respect the rights and dignity of the other, and those who do not. That there are Jews and Palestinians who will exploit the basest fears of their people to dehumanize the other, and those who are willing to hear the stories and empathize with others. That there are those who realize that they can't have their maximalist claims to all the land, and those who idolize the land at the expense of the well-being of the next generation that will surely experience more bloodshed because of the inability of their elders to prioritize people over land. Recently, I received a request to disseminate a petition condemning Palestinian textbooks for teaching hatred of Jews. I responded, the last time scholars examined Palestinian and Israeli textbooks, they found that the hatred of the other presented in these books was about equal. I refuse to share the petition because I'm not interested in demonizing Palestinians while giving my own people a pass on its racism. What will that accomplish? We criticize Palestinians so we don't have to confront the rot within our own people. We think if they would just change, then peace will come. But Jews, we're free to dehumanize Palestinians without any ramifications. This latest conflagration is a result of that delusional thinking. In addition to this petition, I'm often sent videos, articles, books, etc., and asked my opinion. Rabbi, what do you think about these? I often find that there are kernels of truth, but that what's represented is incomplete. And what's omitted is often as important to understand the issue as what's included. A picture may paint 1,000 words, but which pictures we look at determine what we understand and don't understand about the conflict. As Daniel Hartman, the director of the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, summed it up in a recent article, he writes, I am angry because over and over again, we choose narratives that contribute to our moral mediocrity and elevate a bad and unsustainable status quo. In this current crisis, there are people and organizations, especially in the Jewish community, who only woke up to what's happening in Israel when Hamas started lobbing rockets from Gaza. Where were these organizations for the last several weeks when Israel was trying to forcibly evict Palestinians from their homes in the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah? Crickets. Or claiming, if they said anything at all, that the issue is not political, but legal, and that the Israeli courts are dealing with it. That's only part of the picture. There are Jews trying to evict Palestinians from their homes by using an arcane law called the absentee property law, which posits that Palestinians who are not occupying a residence when the War of Independence broke out in 1948 could be considered absentees, and their property could be confiscated even if they have lived there since the war ended. Do you know where these Palestinians who were threatened with eviction in Sheikh Jarrah lived in 1948 when the war broke out? They were living in Talbiya, a neighborhood in the heart of West Jerusalem. Should they be allowed to return there? Nope. The absentee property law can only be used by Jews to reclaim land, not by Palestinians. The situation there is not merely a property dispute. Protesters are challenging a discriminatory law. Moreover, the Israeli government is complicit in the expulsions because they send in the police to evacuate homes, and they are asked by their courts their opinion as to whether or not these homes should be confiscated. This is political. The confrontation in Sheikh Jarrah, of course, is just the latest match thrown into a volatile situation. If you ever spend any time in Israel or watch closely what's happening there, you know that the question is never if there will be another round of violence, but when. The injustice, hatred, and persecution is always simmering just below the surface and can erupt at any moment. The last big war with Hamas was in 2014. For that, it was in 2008. And then there were the intifadas, the Palestinian uprisings of 2000 and 1987, Yitzhak Rabin's assassination in 1995, and all the smaller skirmishes in between. In 1987, in the months leading up to the first intifada, I was working as a waitress at the cafe at the Cinematheque in Jerusalem. One day I showed up to work the dinner shift when I found that the kitchen staff, all of whom were Palestinian, were being dragged to jail because they had gotten into a skirmish with the Israeli border guards. The border guards were trying to arrest a Palestinian bread seller who didn't have the proper permit to sell his bread. He had run across the street from the old city with his bread cart, which had toppled over on the steps leading to the cafe. Bread was strewn down the steps, and everyone was yelling as the kitchen staff was hauled off to jail. The waitresses, all of whom were Jewish Israeli women, said, "You can't blame the Palestinians for fighting with the border guards. They get harassed all the time." This is exactly what I had been hearing nightly from the Palestinian kitchen staff when I would hang out with them in the kitchen when there was a lull in the restaurant. They would tell me stories about their negative interactions with soldiers and the injustices they faced trying to get to work in West Jerusalem, or to get building permits in their villages, etc. Shortly after I left that job and returned to the States, the first intifada broke out. American Jews were up in arms. They were surprised because they were unaware of Palestinian life in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. And this was before checkpoints and border walls. Because I had had a front seat to the conflict, I felt obligated to share the stories I had heard and to educate my community. This is how my activism began. From this experience, I developed the conviction that hearing each other's stories and creating alliances across ethnic backgrounds is the only way to develop true empathy for each other, and ultimately, the only way to resolve the conflict. The two sides in the conflict are not Israeli and Palestinian, but those who believe in justice and peace for both peoples and those who don't. In addition to the bombing now happening in Israel, there has been an explosion of violence in many cities in Israel, as Palestinian and Jewish mobs beat people up and destroy property. Although there has been violence on both sides, the Israeli police turn a blind eye when it's Jews attacking Palestinians. This morning, I received a heart-wrenching call from Rabbi, who is our family's adopted Palestinian son. We met Rabbi in 2010 when he came to live with us while he and my son Yonah attended a program called Hands of Peace, a program that's based here in Glenview that brings together Americans, Palestinians, and Jewish Israelis to discuss the conflict in Israel. Over the years, we have spent time with his family who live in a town outside of Haifa, and he has stayed at our house in Evanston many times. Rabbi now lives in Haifa. And when he called me today, he painted a pretty grim picture of what is happening there. Well-armed Jews from outside of Haifa, possibly settlers from the West Bank, have arrived in Haifa and are harassing Palestinians. They are part of a movement called Lehava, which is linked to far right-wing members of the Knesset, Ben Gvir and Smotrich. The Haifa police have not been protecting Palestinians and have been arresting Palestinians who've been trying to protect their homes. He doesn't feel safe leaving his apartment. I told him that I'd seen pictures of Jewish Israelis standing in solidarity with Palestinians in Haifa, and I asked if this had been helpful. He replied that they are gathering to protest on the Carmel, predominantly Jewish neighborhood at the top of the Carmel Mountain, and not in the Palestinian neighborhoods below, where the violence is occurring. He's feeling desperate to get the Palestinian story out and for the US to intervene and protect Palestinians. He said that the social media of many Palestinians is being blocked, and he's been videotaping what's been happening. And he asked me if I would share some of those videotapes. They're very disturbing. I just have one that I would like to share with you, that you can see what is happening to Palestinians who are being harassed, and a particular Palestinian whose car is being attacked. You can play it, Becky. Why is fighting broken out in the streets in this round of fighting? This is a new dimension to the conflict. Rabbi Jill Jacobs, the executive director of Torah, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights, she writes this about the fighting in the streets. The shocking violence in the streets is a result of years and years of provocation by Prime Minister Netanyahu and others who cast Palestinian citizens as a fifth column, passed a nation-state law which enshrines legal inequity, and neglected Palestinian communities, who spent much of the past year protesting against the indifference by the Israeli government and police to intracommunal violence. In the past few days, Israeli Jewish extremist groups have organized on Telegram and WhatsApp to travel to mixed cities in order to carry out violent and destructive attacks against Palestinian citizens, their homes, and their businesses, which you just witnessed. In these same towns, Palestinian citizens have torched synagogues, seriously wounded Jews, and attacked Jewish homes and businesses. There is no justification for such violence by either party, but it is not random. It is a direct effect of years of government policies and incitement. Why worry about textbooks, I was thinking, when the rhetoric from the government and actions of people on the ground are hateful and discriminatory? You don't need a book to see what you're experiencing on the street. Rabbi Jacobs continues, part of the background is also Netanyahu's desperate attempt to hold on to power during a week when a potential new governing coalition came close to ousting him. Hamas, too, is playing a power game with their rivals in the Palestinian Authority after President Abbas canceled planned Palestinian elections. The burning question today is not if you are pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian. That's not the correct binary. Rather, are you willing to join forces so that Palestinians and Jews can live in peace and security and with equal rights to live freely and determine their own destiny? We can yell and scream until we are blue in the face about Israel's right to defend itself and post pictures of ourselves with a "We Stand with Israel" logo. But what will this get us? Of course, Israel has a right to defend itself. But is bombing Gaza to smithereens and letting hordes of violent Jews terrorize Palestinians who are citizens of the state of Israel? Rawi Khatib, my Palestinian son, he has an Israeli passport. I don't. Will this protect Israel? I think not. The violence we are seeing now is just a symptom of the disease, which cannot be eliminated until we cure the disease itself. As Gershom Gorenberg put it brilliantly in an article in the Washington Post entitled, "Israelis and Palestinians can't go on like this. weep for us. We ignore the underlying issues at our own peril. And many of you remember Gershom Gorenberg. He came to speak about his new book, which is about the Nazis who were in North Africa and in Egypt. And he's been also speaking at Beth Emet, both in Israel and at Beth Emet, about the conflict. And he writes, "We could go on forever this way. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his cheering squad wanted us to think the Intifada was long past. We were secure. We were supposed to believe Gaza could suffer quietly under blockade. The conflict, if not over, was under control. We could make peace with far-off kingdoms without giving anything up or seeing the people living next to us." Continues, "The police used familiar aggressive tactics against protests at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, ignoring the effect of clashes on sacred ground. Because nothing had blown up, the government acted as if nothing would blow up." Israelis don't see what's happening in Gaza or in the West Bank. They're literally walled off from it and don't have to pay attention to the persecution of Palestinians there. When groups like Breaking the Silence, former IDF soldiers who share their stories about their army service in the West Bank, tell Israelis about the reality of the occupation, they are often silenced or shunned. Gorenberg pointedly shows how this willful ignorance by the Israeli public, combined with the complicity of the Israeli government, is dangerous to Israel's security. And I can attest to this myself. When I spend time in Israel, I spend a lot of time in the West Bank, and I come back and I tell my Israeli friends what I see. And what's 5-10 miles away from their house, they never experience, even though they're so close. And to this we add that Palestinian elections never happen, and Israeli elections happen all too often, leaving a leadership void. We cannot possibly be surprised when violence erupts. I know it's no surprise to anyone at Beth Emet that I'm very involved with J Street. The past 5 years, I've been a co-chair of the National Rabbinic and Cantorial Cabinet. And I'll tell you the reason I'm involved. I'm involved with J Street because I believe that J Street has done more to change the conversation in Washington, D.C. about Israel, making room for new creative thinking that considers the rights of both Palestinians and Jews, which I believe will help Israel extricate itself from this morass and reach a just and lasting peace with the Palestinians. Strong American intervention and mediation will be needed to bring peace. Make no mistake about it. It's also important to support Israeli and Palestinian peace and justice organizations that are doing important work on the ground, but who are perennially underfunded and overlooked. I will mention a few with which I am personally familiar to give you a sense of what's out there and to encourage you to support these organizations. Omdim B'Yachad, Standing Together, an organization that brings Jews and Palestinian citizens of Israel to work together to build a shared society. Kolot HaChayrim, Other Voices, Jews and Bedouins who live in the south of Israel near the Gaza border, who are working to develop relationships with each other and the Gazans through technology. I spoke about them in my Devar on Yom Kippur. The Parents Circle Families Forum, Jews and Palestinians who have both lost loved ones in the conflict. Those of us who read a Paragon learned about this organization. Combatants for Peace, Jews and Palestinians who've been engaged as combatants and now are committed to work together for peace. Harat Tzedek, Rabbi Arik Asherman's organization that works with individual Palestinians to access their grazing land and navigate the Israeli administration that governs the Palestinians living in the West Bank. ALMEP, the Alliance for Middle East Peace, a network of Israeli and Palestinian peace builders. Many of these organizations have spoken at Beth Emet over many years, over the last 21 years since I've been at Beth Emet, I know, and some of them will be speaking to us in the future. All of them are powerful and worthwhile organizations that deserve our support. There is also a petition being circulated encouraging the U.S. to intervene. Becky's going to put it in chat now. Sign it. Jewish members of Congress, including our very own Jan Schakowsky, wrote a letter to President Biden today, urging him to become more actively involved. Secretary of State Blinken And President Biden had been much too silent about the issues happening in Israel. On Sunday night, we arrive at Mount Sinai to receive the Torah on the holiday of Shavuot. What can we learn from Torah to guide our way at this difficult time? There's a concept within our tradition, mipnei darkei shalom, on account of the ways of peace. I find this concept particularly resonant and applicable at this moment. We learn that we must treat non-Jews who live among us the same as we treat Jews if we want to create a peaceful and harmonious society. The Talmud teaches, we do not prevent the non-Jewish poor from gleaning from the corners of the field, the portion of one's harvest that is meant for the poor, on account of the ways of peace. It was taught in a city with Jews and non-Jews that leaders from both communities should be appointed and basic necessities should be given to non-Jews as well as Jews, on account of darkei shalom, the ways of peace. The Rambam, Maimonides, a great medieval commentator, adds the proof text for this concept. He teaches, Psalm 145 says, Tov Adonai l'kol v'rachamav al kol ma'asav. God is good to all, God's mercy is upon all God's works. And this verse from Proverbs that we sing as we put the Torah back in the ark, D'racheha darkei noam v'chol netiototeha shalom. The Torah's ways are ways of pleasantness, and all its paths are peace. I pray at this dark and precarious time in our people's history, we can see beyond the binary of Jew and Palestinian, and instead be united by God's mercy and pursue the path of peace together, darkei shalom. As Gorenberg concludes his article, somehow this will stop. We will see each other's faces, each other's pain. It is what can come after anger and grief, what must come, I have to believe. Palestinians and Israelis must see the humanity of each other and realize that the enemy is not the other, but those who refuse to believe that Jews and Palestinians can live in peace, dignity, and security. Amen.